Okay, so Adrian, first of all, thank you for taking the time to talk to me and to the students at the University of Waterloo. This is going to be very useful for them as they prepare for jobs that are a lot of which are going to be very technologically focused. Can I just ask you, first of all, to tell me about the job that you do at the University of Sussex today, and what led you to be interested in what we're going to talk about?
Okay, Peter. Well, look, thanks for inviting me to have this conversation. I hope what I've got to say is useful or interesting. I'm, I mean, my formal title, I work at the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex University, where I'm Professor of Technology and Society. But basically and essentially, I'm a contract researcher. So I work on research projects, and my job is to raise funding from external sources, from research funding agencies, from European Commission, from NGOs, wherever, to conduct research projects. So I'm constantly pitching research proposals and ideas to funding agencies to get projects going. In recent years, I had good fortune with colleagues to get funding for a research centre that ran for 10 years called the STEP Centre, which stands for Social, Technological and Environmental Pathways to Sustainability, a bit of a mouthful. And I kind of coordinated some research there with colleagues in Argentina and India and Colombia on looking at what we call grassroots innovation movements. And these are like groups of neighbours or civil society organisations, activists who were kind of appropriating and hacking technology and coming up with kind of grassroots innovations to meet the kind of needs and aspirations of their communities. So I've been working on that in recent years, and that included case studies into some of the initiatives that we'll be talking about shortly. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm kind of based at SPRU, doing these research projects and trying to do that in a very engaged way. So always working with practitioners, people, you know, the real experts out there in the working world, just to kind of see how, I guess, how research can sort of help them really. Sometimes by providing some reflection, a bit of a space to take a step back from all the day-to-day pressures and to sort of think a bit more strategically perhaps, or to consider what they're doing in a different light, how it could be done more effectively, or sometimes posing quite critical and challenging questions or findings for them. And the department there is quite policy oriented. So a lot of our research is engaged in how to develop better policies that could guide the development of technology and innovation in society, especially when we're faced with things like climate change, inequality and sustainable development, you know, and the need to make sure future technologies are much more environmentally friendly, much more socially inclusive and so forth.
Sounds like a great job. But your work is focused on improving the contribution that technology makes to society. Can you talk a little bit about socially useful production, what that is and how that concept emerged?
Yeah, it's a long-standing concept, and it's a term that sort of fell out of use really. It dates back to the 1970s. It's not hard and fast. I mean, maybe I'll tell a bit about how it emerged, but essentially it's arguing that rather than developing technologies and using technologies for selling things on the market for kind of exchange value and profit, that really the kind of guiding principles ought to be designing things and using technologies for purposes that are socially useful. So socially useful production rather than profit-driven production. And it emerged from kind of amongst grassroots trades unionists in England, in the UK, in the mid-1970s. The UK back then had a very large manufacturing sector that was going through a lot of changes, restructuring in various ways. New technologies were coming in, like computer integrated manufacturing, but also kind of capital. Investors were changing where they were putting their money and kind of moving out of manufacturing and finding they could, what became like financial instruments, investing in real estate and other forms. There are other ways of making money that seem more attractive than manufacturing. And also there's rising international competition. So there are a lot of redundancies and layoffs in these manufacturing factories and these manufacturing communities. And one company, which is called Lucas Aerospace, the sort of shop floor trade unionists there did what lots of workers were doing back then. They were going on strike and protesting against these redundancies. They were occupying factories. They were being quite militant. But they also did something that was quite unusual at the time, still is, I think, in that they developed an alternative plan for the company. And they're saying because they noticed, one of the features of the company was that around half of its products were for the defence sector. That was public money, state money coming in as a customer of those goods, to make components for weapon systems, for fighter aircraft and so forth. And so the workers were saying, well, look, rather than that public money being used to manufacture military technologies, let's use the money to make socially useful products. And so they consulted all the workers on the shop floor and said, look, this is the equipment we've got here. We're skilled machinists. We know how to make things. What could we make in place of the things that we're currently making? There are also other ways that kind of, and that's where the idea of socially useful production kind of emerged from, really. They proposed all sorts of things like wind turbines, heat pumps, equipment for helping people with disabilities, new kind of like public transport technologies, most notably a kind of road rail bus, that could go on roads and rails. There's over 150 kind of designs and prototypes that they developed, and including economic analyses to show which ones were kind of viable, could actually be sold on a marketplace. And that kind of seeded a campaign. I mean, they publicised what they were doing. They alerted others in the trade union movement, and workers at other companies and factories started emulating this and coming up with their alternative plans. And a bit of a sort of social movement gathered about the right to socially useful production in place of being made redundant and receiving public money and unemployment benefits, and also in place of large sums of public money either going into the military, or what was also happening back then was that the government was subsidising the owners of these companies to restructure and to become what they said more efficient in terms of mergers and so forth. That was actually leading to massive unemployment. It got up to 3 million people at one point. Now, this idea that workers were intelligent enough and had the skills and the power to suggest useful technological designs, not simply, not just make the things, but actually suggest what products and what technologies ought to be. This was like weird, unheard of, really, amongst management class and owners. And the response there was rejection, resistance to this. The government as well was reluctant to get involved and resisted it as well. Interestingly, amongst trade unions as well, there was some resistance among the people at the top of the hierarchy, because they understood that they were accustomed to trade unions being about negotiating pay and working conditions, or, when made redundant, a decent redundancy package, retraining and a payment for being made redundant. That's what they knew how to do. They didn't like the idea of getting involved in the design or the negotiation of technologies and products, and being challenged, if you like, from the shop floor. Nevertheless, the workers on the shop floor persisted, arguing for socially useful production, arguing also that these discussions ought to be open further to the communities in which they live and the issues of concern there. So you found environmentalists got involved, left-leaning environmentalists at least. Local community groups and community development workers got involved. Some local governments, particularly in London, Coventry, and Sheffield, that had kind of left-wing and therefore sympathetic city councils, they also got involved. And maybe I'll mention a bit about London in a moment. Links were also made internationally. There was a union movement in Australia that I'm connections with, in the US as well, but also most influentially with workers and researchers in Scandinavia, in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And there were kind of design researchers and activists and trade unionists, people like Pelle Enne there, who were inspired by this Lucas plan, what the workers at Lucas Aerospace had been done, and this movement for socially useful production. And they started running projects in Scandinavia, looking at how workers could be involved in the design and the introduction of computer technologies into their industries, such as printing, such as some of the metallurgy industries, and so forth. And looking to try and develop more kind of human and worker-centered technologies. Because you have to remember back then what the management consultants and business leaders were talking about, that were anticipating then with this first wave of computer integrated manufacturing and computer technologies, was this first wave of automation, where they were talking about the workerless factory. And the counter argument to that, coming from the socially useful production kind of movement and the sort of participatory technology design people in Scandinavia, was, well, there are other ways of configuring computer technologies. We could use it in a way that enhances the workers' skills, that enables them to add even more value to the product. And that's what they pioneered. And they're very much motivated by commitment to democracy, to workplace democracy, and that workers as well as managers should have a say in how work's organised in factories, and what kind of products are developed in society. Now that kind of very radical vision never really came to fruition. We didn't get the workplace democracies that they were aspiring to. But some of the methods that they developed in participatory design of technologies, such as mock-ups and work groups and so forth, did become very influential and are now used by businesses to make sure they develop more kind of user-friendly technologies. And also, I think their argument that technology is a very social thing. It affects our lives just it similarly, or if not more, than the laws of the land. You think about the way certain technologies affect our working day, they shape the way our cities look and work as well, and yet citizens are rarely consulted on the development of those technologies. We come in at quite a late stage as consumers. Do you want to buy it or not? And sometimes, certainly with some of the platform technologies these days, we're compelled. We have to give our consent because it's the only way we can participate in certain technologically based activities in society. So they were just arguing back then that we need to think about ways of introducing some democratic deliberation into the development and use of new technologies. And I think that was influential. It kind of inspired and influenced people in universities who were doing research on science and technology, and it kind of was the sort of activist route of what became known as science and technology studies. And so, yeah, I mean, that's very long-winded. So socially useful production is all of that.
Well, it's all very important.
Yeah. And I think it's one of the interesting things of studying that history has been how, and I've been around sort of talking about it at various events in the UK and writing about it, actually talking about it internationally, in India, is how it seems to resonate with people. Given some of the concerns around technology nowadays, and a new wave of automation is being talked about. So there's some of these concerns, and this sort of movement for socially useful production is a sort of forgotten bit of history. People did show it's possible to do things differently, and you know, I think they also demonstrated the importance of having a diversity of approaches. I mean, it's not to say that they were correcting what they did. I think just having a plurality of ways of working with technology, of thinking about technology, is incredibly important. And so I think we need to think about that nowadays as well. I mean, one kind of group, if you like, that found it really interesting was I've also been doing learning with and working with sort of fab labs and hacker spaces, sort of community-based digital design and fabrication workshops, and the sort of maker movement and these things. And so some people within that have been fascinated about this movement of socially useful production, because intriguingly, one of the things I mentioned earlier, that one of the bases of support for these initiatives was some radical local authorities, including the Greater London Council. Londoners in 1982, I think it was, they voted in a socialist city government, the Labour Party, and a very radical wing of the Labour Party, who were committed to protecting jobs and trying to save manufacturing in the city. And they launched a Greater London Enterprise Board, and they were committed to promoting industry, but through kind of cooperative means. So they would subsidise the creation of cooperatives, they'd take over struggling companies and try and revive them. Their technology director was someone called Mike Cooley, who had been one of the leaders of the grassroots trade unions and workers at the Lucas plant. He'd been kind of mobilising this movement for socially useful production, articulating it, expressing some of the ideas and principles behind it. He was sacked by Lucas Aerospace for that, his activism there, ultimately. I was good, actually. No, just another incident. That was the workers there, though. I mean, part of the interest was the peace movement. This is also about arms conversion as well. It's socially useful. They were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979 as well. Anyway, so Mike Cooley was out of work, and so he was hired by the leaders of the Greater London Council to be the technology director. And one of the things he did was set up a network of 5 community workshops in London. So these were open workshops where anyone could walk in off the street and have access to machine tools, to design, to expertise as well. So people linked to the polytechnics in London to just come in and materialize their ideas. If they had an idea for a prototype or something like that, they could come in and develop it. And people did, And the idea was, because you benefit from this freely accessible, then your design goes into a kind of product bank and other people can use it. So it's very reminiscent of how sort of maker spaces and hacker spaces are working today. This kind of more very open source, kind of commons based and collaborative approaches to, hacking technologies, developing them, and so forth. So I think there are sort of all sorts of different sorts of resonances there, if you like, that kind of echo, from back in time and back then.
Absolutely. And you've talked about the Greater London Council. I'm interested too in how information technology and its development today might be impacted by socially useful production approaches, and how this might influence the development of technology in ways that may be more progressive, that might be aligned with wishes people might have for them. So do you, as you consider socially useful production, what do you think we can learn from that for information technology today?
Yeah, intriguingly, I said there was some interest in this history. And then one day I got an email from Richard Stallman, who from the free software, and GNU world, who'd read. I wrote an article in the Guardian about this Lucas plan, social use production. I think he must have come across that, and he asked me if I'd heard of the free software movement, and I had, but I can't claim to be as familiar, knowledgeable about it as socially useful production. But I think they share certain principles, if you like, around openness and inclusion and making sure the users of technology have some control over it as well. So I think, and if you like, it comes back to this point about diversity, having different approaches to technology, different social approaches. So, and I think the free software movement and now things like open hardware movement are incredibly important in that respect. It's not necessarily about saying which approach is better, open or closed, some of the more corporate-based technologies. It's just that with that diversity, then when societies become concerned about the directions technology can take, there are other options available to them. And I think that's, fundamentally important and a kind of basis for us thinking about how to democratize technology. It's giving people access to it and so forth. So I think there's that side to it, if you like. How do we try and open up information and communication technologies to make sure they're more progressive, which is to say, they don't contribute to increasing inequalities in society. They're not a source of or an amplifier of social injustices. And importantly, they don't undermine environmental sustainability. When you think about information, digital technology, they have a huge environmental footprint. Think about the energy consumption of server farms. I don't know if this is true, but I read the other day, someone said that already the energy consumption of blockchain is the same as Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and it's only just starting as a technology. So we have to be really careful and think about the materiality of these technologies. So I think there are all sorts of initiatives and people working to develop information communication technology in different ways. It's also important if you think about repair, repurposing and remanufacturing technologies. There's a great organisation in London called the Restart Project that organise community meetups and parties to repair electrical goods and computers and so forth and our mobile phones and try and extend the life of the products, but also to get people to think about, the social consequences of technologies and to ask why the technologies take the forms they do. There are social causes and decisions behind technologies. They don't just appear out of nowhere. The technologists make decisions under the influence of the societies they live in. So that's another reason why I think different kind of arenas or venues, the kind of so where people can code differently to, say, in a more institutionalized setting, who can tinker with technology. These alternative spaces, clearly, they don't have the kind of capital and the financial resources like some of the big players have. The sort of GAFA businesses who are investing a fortune into next generation technologies, but nevertheless, I think they beg questions of, where those big investments are taking us. Maybe we need to redistribute and open up some of the investment decisions that go into technologies. So there's that aspect of information communication technologies. There's also the role that ICT can play in kind of progressive causes more generally, in facilitating democracies, if you like, and discussions and so forth. And there are lots of great examples there. I mean, I'm talking to you from Madrid, and you've got here you've got the Decide Madrid and the whole Consul software that came out of the 15M movements in Spain, which is a kind of citizen participation platform to take part in decisions on how the council is run, how the city is run, and where money gets invested. And in Barcelona as well, with Decide in Barcelona, they're developing these free and open software platforms to help citizens get involved in decisions. And cities around the world are taking this up and emulating it. There are also kind of groups where something I've been looking at recently is using kind of sensors and creating platforms for sort of citizen science projects. And an example there is a project that was called Making Sense that's just been running in Barcelona. And that was working with neighbours who lived around a really noisy square. It was the square in the city where everyone goes to drink at night, to have the botellón, they called it there. And it was just really, and this had changed the characteristics of the square. So there was a project where the neighbours, to bring noise measuring technology and generate data that neighbours could measure in their home and on their balcony how noisy the square was over the course of the day, and then a platform as well where they could compare each other's data levels as well, and they could make them public and open or keep them private. But that involved the technologists learning how to make a technology that works for the neighbours, and the neighbours learning how this piece of technology could empower their campaign to try and do something about the noise in the square, and to get the council to take some measures to bring the noise down. What's really interesting about that, I think, is that they were generating data, okay? And it's sort of like a bottom-up version of the smart city. The smart city is just throwing technology at the city fabric, creating big data, and you can see, what's going on in the city. Interestingly, that Barcelona's smart city technology platform already had a noise sensor in the square, but no one really knew it was there, and no one was paying attention to it. It was only when the citizens took control of the technology for themselves and created their data and started using that to put pressure on the council and to put pressure on some of the factors behind why the square had become so noisy, that they would be able to then have a negotiation. And now they're in the process of figuring out, what changes can be made in the square to try and make it less noisy, sorry. I mean, the point about this is that the data doesn't create the change. A community built around the data, created the data, built around it, and then began using old-fashioned community development skills, how to mobilise, how to do a campaign, how to speak to your representatives, to then try and press for changes. So it's this combination of technology and old-fashioned kind of community development that's the key, I think. Someone said to me, you need thick data rather than big data. You need data that's socially thick. It has some meaning and it can help people mobilise. So I think they're just a few examples of how ICT could make more progressive or play a more progressive role. It's kind of wide open, I think, really. That's how I see it.
Yeah, and that makes sense. As far as the direction that technological development takes in the future is concerned, I mean, the developments are going to happen within wider political forces and trends that are happening today. Have you got thoughts about what you think that will result in? So at the same time as there being activity to some degree enable citizens to participate in the ways that you've described, we do also have the activity of the larger companies and activities of governments and things like that. Overall, do you have thoughts about what the direction may be?
It's a tough question. I don't know. I've got some thoughts, but I don't know if they're well thought through thoughts.
Sure.
I mean, you're right. I mean, obviously, we're talking about this post Cambridge Analytica and learning what Facebook, that unethical activities with data. So this is really live, and it's also emerging at a moment where politics, nationally and internationally, we're seeing the rise of kind of populist authoritarianism and some very dark and scary forces out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that combination is really scary. We're probably surveyed more than any citizen of the Soviet Union ever was.
Yeah.
So there's lots of reasons to be kind of fearful. And similarly with the latest wave of automation and AI as well, there's lots of kind of reasons to feel insecure and fearful, and I think we need to confront that. But it comes back, I think, and I think that's a matter for political programs, social mobilizations, being a kind of citizen, how you relate to that, and what you want to try and do about that. But I think some of these alternatives that I was just mentioning, what becomes really important alongside that, though, is to create more hopeful futures and spaces of hope. And that's where some of these alternatives are important, I think. They are very small, but I think they can and will attract attention as more and more people become concerned about the way they're governed, either through legislatures and national governments or what have you, or through technology as well. Technology kind of governs us, and what's really important is to open up black box of technology and to show that it can be done in other ways, that with a different set of social assumptions, with a different set of principles, with changed value, reordered values, you can create other forms of technology. And that's what these diverse groups are doing, I think. What happens when you design some technology that's not designed to extract data, but it's just to develop a simple function, like, for ticketing or mobility or something like that. You can do that. There are packages that do that and restrict things in that way. And actually go beyond the debate about how to control or store data and the ethics of that, important as that is, but maybe, shifting the debate to the ethics of creating data in the first place. What's reasonable to do and what's unreasonable and not kind of permitted. So ostensibly powerful and dominating as some of these forces are, and these technologies, and these big players, and we feel like we're locked into certain platforms. I think if the mood and climate changes, then things can change, and will change. And that's why we need these alternatives and this diversity. That's why it's really, really important. There was something else I was going to say, but it's escaped me. So maybe it'll come back in a moment, maybe.
We can bring it back in. But
yeah.
Are there particular aspects of policy that you think should be the focus in ensuring that there is a more positive impact of technology?
Yeah, I think the first thing policymakers need to do, and technologists for that matter, is to learn how to listen very carefully and how to look very attentively. Look beyond the immediate actors and the usual sort of suspects, and to see where things are being done differently, being done more innovatively, we could say. To use their innovation's a buzzword amongst policymakers. But, and a lot of these initiatives are being really, really innovative. So to make use of that. And I think encouraging them to be more diverse in who they support or work with and so forth. So more diversity. If some of these technological skills and capabilities are a public good, then fund, more community workshops, for example. Yeah, or encourage universities to provide a greater diversity of courses for our future engineers and so forth. And I think actually challenging some of the concentration of investment in research and development that exists. Whether that's the military or some of the big multinationals now, that really needs to be challenged. I mean, these are really tough issues because they get into questions of taxation and trade policy, you kind of and what national governments can do, or their capacity to coordinate and do a more kind of international level sorts of actions. But I mean, for me, I think the key policy thing would be to promote more diversity in technology development, definitely.
Okay.
And and then also to connect things up. but to see how aspirations for sustainable development, for example, all the world's governments have signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals, which have to be met by 2017. And there's the environmental ones, but there's also ones about gender equality. So how do we make technology less gendered? Yeah. One of the goals is about the future of work, dignified work. So how does all of the policies that are promoting AI, promoting automation, how do they connect with the Sustainable Development Goals and these international commitments that we've got? So again, I think we need to open up some of these technology discussions and debates to demonstrate there's nothing automatic about automation. It's a social choice. It's the way we go about making machine tools. The socially useful production people in the 70s were, developing human-centered approach to computer technologies. What hackers and open hardware people are doing today, arguably, is also thinking about design and manufacturing in very different ways that could potentially be more human-centered. We're thinking about sustainability and sort of circular economies and remanufacturing. That probably suggests that we need very versatile and adaptable manufacturing facilities and production lines where you can kind of bolt things together and repurpose them, rather than a very, very tightly integrated and coupled cyber physical system, that's designed for manufacturing, but as soon as you want to introduce some repaired component or some awkward element to it, it just fails. It can't handle it. We need to get away from them linear production systems and get back to, and to think of futures where we've got much more flexible, locally rooted, adaptable, versatile production systems. And I think people have to be at the center of them systems using technologies, but maybe not these, cyber physical, global Internet of Things manufacturing systems that the Industry 4.0 kind of discourse is promoting and talking about. I just don't see how sustainable development features it. So again, that's but it's a very powerful wave. There's a lot of reasons why companies want to get rid of workers and work with machines, but they bring problems, and there are other ways of organizing work, and there are examples out there of how it can be done. So keep coming back to this diversity point, really. So that's what I think policymakers need to do. That's what engineers need to do as well. Hopefully there's those, find out them spaces, and if you're motivated by these issues, go out and get involved, and maybe even make a living in some of these ways of working.
You're answering a lot of my questions with each answer, which is good. It means I don't have to ask all of them. But it does also mean that that a number of the questions that I was going to ask we've covered. I'd like probably just to ask one more question, which is, many of the people who are watching this interview will be students at the University of Waterloo. They'll be engineers or computer scientists often, mostly. And I'm keen to know what advice you would want to give them, what you'd want them to think about as they go into the workplace.
Wow, that's a tough one. I think, I don't know if I ought to give them some of that. I mean, I trained originally in mechanical engineering, was my first degree.
Okay.
So, and then ended up in academia, moving into sort of social sciences and trying to understand some of these more political issues, because I was motivated by a wondering or frustration about why engineering and technological ingenuity was being put to some purposes that I happen to disagree with, and not other purposes. So the university where I was at, some of the lecturers, examples would be like military technology or defense industry, and it's like, well, that's okay, but can't we have some more sort of peaceful examples in our lectures as well? I think that's where it started, and then I became quite interested and committed to questions of sustainable development and equality and these sorts of questions. So I actually went into postgraduate study then to try and learn about these issues, and never really left academia. and I've ended up here. I don't know if I'd recommend that route. It's important that not all of us stay in academia. So I would encourage, your class or students to get out there and do stuff, or those who do stay in academia to kind of get out there and work with people as well. I mentioned earlier, like trying to do engaged research. So when I'm proposing projects, I always talk with practitioners and people and try and understand what would be relevant or useful for them, or what's maybe an approach that's they're unable to kind of consider but complements in some way. So I think it's, be engaged, learn to listen carefully, adopt different points of view as well. I think one thing, leaving an engineering course, and actually prior to that, I'd worked as a machine, doing like machine tool apprenticing and, making things. I'm from Birmingham, where a city that makes lots of things, and from a working class background. So I grew up machining. And I think all that training, and then at the university as well, I was sort of taught that there was always a kind of optimal or elegant solution. There's an engineering, and that engineering approach. And I had to kind of unlearn that a bit to try and see that there were always a variety of solutions, and they were all optimal in different ways. Okay, so I think that's what I mean about this adopting different points of view. And I think that's really important for engineers who want to serve some kind of social or public good, and thinking about, because you need to see it from different sorts of points of view and help people get involved in, technology development, but actually the social choices involved in technology development. Are we making this for ease of manufacturing? Are we making this for longevity and repairability? Those are social choices, but they then send you off on quite different, design and engineering kind of trajectories. So listening carefully, thinking critically, I think, but also, not maybe being too hard on oneself either. These are very collective decision issues, and it's about being a good citizen in society. It's important that we have people working in kind of, technology companies, developing the platforms that we rely on and so forth, but you may be constrained in how much you can kind of influence that within a company, but if you can be contributing to a culture that's opening these things up, whether through your work or just as a citizen, I think that's really, really important. And I don't know, Peter, if the students are familiar with science and technology studies. I mean, while they're studying, if there's some good books. There's one, I think it's Stephen Matthewman, Technology and Social Theory, which provides a really good, nice overview of all these sorts of issues and this work. So I'd encourage them also maybe to rewrite, not stop when they graduate and they get their certificate and enter work. I think that's it. I mean, I personally didn't have a strategy. I didn't plan to become an academic. I kind of just followed an interest, and it's sort of where I've ended up and where it's taken me. So sometimes that's been great. Other times it's been difficult. But I think it's about recognizing opportunities and grabbing them. That's it. I think. Yeah.
Thank you for doing this with me today, Adrian. I know the students will benefit greatly from it, and I think it's a very good thing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Thanks.